Malgas Island lies about 1 kilometre from the southwest African coast, and thousands of seabirds use it as a nesting ground. Sadly, things are changing, and this safe haven is under threat. Exploring these elements through the eyes of the crew, this is another story of our epic Earth. This glorified collection of slippery boulders has afforded protection to cormorants, gannets and oyster catchers for thousands of years. The birds' supply of food fish, their breeding cycles and the roll call of the changing seasons has been uninterrupted until recently. Camera director Graham Duane has spent time here getting to know some of the intricacies of the island.
Arriving on Malgas is a special experience. It's remote by virtue of the fact that it's secluded by attractive hostile ocean. The west coast is cold and windy, and Malgas is rocky and quite difficult to get onto.
While the island itself has remained intact, the surrounding ocean has dealt the inhabitants an indirect but cruel blow. The massive volumes of food fish that traditionally shoaled in the cold, rich waters here have largely disappeared. Sardines make up the bulk of food for both adults and growing chicks. The fishing competition around Malgas has been too fierce of late, and the lack of this staple food for these species has forced a subtle but cruel response. Getting close to the birds on Malgas gives one a glimpse into the character of these animals. And whilst having some very refined adaptations that enable them to fly long distances, spotting and hunting fish, they also have a very comical side.
There's the stock standard ridiculous sky pointing, where the birds will spend long periods of time showing each other their striped throats. Their facial expressions suggest a certain absence of reason. And incoming birds that try their best to land as close to the nest pile as possible are always subjected to a workover by the neighbours. As with territorial disputes, these can get quite ugly, sucking in innocent bystanders too. They also do this crazy duck and dive head swoop, gyrating the body and the head, in a rhythm kept only on planet Gannet.
When one looks closely at their hardware, they become far more impressive. The front set eyes are designed to judge distance looking downwards, and eyelids are handy when entering the water at such high speed. Disproportionately large webbed feet enable them to chase fish well beneath the surface, even if this means a certain clumsiness on dry land. Everything is streamlined, from the racy design of the head downwards. Once in the sky, these birds literally become air-to-sea missiles. The beak also has a hinge, which allows them to gape wider than rigid mandibles would allow. It's only when one sees them in action that the success of these adaptations become clearly apparent. During September, life on the island seems normal. The gannets are busy laying claim to nest piles, and the rebuilding process has begun. Gently, the birds collect debris and dirt to reconstruct the turret-like platforms on which they'll nest. Having established a functional nest pile, pairs then commence laying, and a single egg is guarded. Smashed shells, long since abandoned, are evidence of the threat that kelp gulls now pose to the gannets. It's now late summer. Fledglings have grown rapidly in size, and while the petrified carcasses of birds that didn't make it litter the rookery floor, the ones that did are entering a new phase of life.
Most of these birds have lost their downy fluff and have been transformed into the slaty grey forms that mimic the shape of the adults, just not in the same crisp white and yellow. Some adults were still on eggs, but we figured that these were just late starters. There was still quite an array of fluffy chicks, again remnants of later breeding cycles within the species. All of these birds, however, were in the process of losing the fine down that covered their bodies, making way for sleeker flight feathers. As the soft white feathers are shed, we could see them blowing away in little white chunks. The adults also seem to tend to the young quite closely at this stage, and there's a lot of preening going on. We got the sense that the juveniles had become hard work, and that it would soon be time for these dark chicks to fend for themselves. Every evening the parents would return to the island with food, and the demanding chicks would relieve them of their load.
Experience the rhythm of life closer than ever. Incredible moments of our Earth's natural wonders. Full of excitement and surprises. The story of our dynamic planet revealed. Epic Earth, Wednesdays on Discovery Channel and Animal Planet.
There's claims out there, and they're worth a fortune.
Often bought for pennies.
$5,000 for the whole claim?
Yep. They can be worth much more. We work with claim owners to get their properties up and running. This is our version of the American dream. If there is something here, we are going to find that out. Look at that. What do you think of that?
We couldn't have done this without you guys.
Reclaimed premieres 4th May on Discovery Channel.
The most crucial element needed for fledglings to begin learning the dynamics of flight is moving air. Early morning temperature inversions result in fog banks that are soon drifting swiftly out to sea. These breezes transform the activity on the floor of the island from one of idleness to a mass of frenetic flapping forms. Getting airborne can be a difficult affair. On mornings when the wind doesn't blow on the island, the adults clamber up to a raised vantage point and use this as a springboard to flight. The resulting stares of the juveniles tells a story in itself. These young are thinking about flight. The adult birds are the ones that set about taking off first, and despite years of experience, they still battle to get airborne.
Every now and again there was an abortive takeoff. the bird waddling off, trying not to be too conspicuous. As the wind gusted, birds took to the air collectively, and before long the whole sky was full of them. They seemed to circle the colony a few times before striking out to sea at a tangent to go fishing. The sight of the adults taking off seemed to inspire the dark fledglings. These desperate flapping sessions were hilarious, and the birds would glance at each other, trying to gauge their progress alongside that of their neighbors. We could see that the birds could just feel the first suggestion of what it's like to feel lift.
While the gannet flight school continues, windy mornings also bring with them masses of cormorants. This inter-island air traffic descends on Malgas, the huge flock settling on the southeast boulders.
The variation in the wind on this part of the coast seems to bring with it a whole set of different circumstances. On calm days, the activity on and around the island would stagnate. But when the wind blew from a different direction, we often got surprises. On this particular morning, it was the arrival of thousands of these birds, and they'd used the island as a sort of halfway stop, obviously on their way up the coast. The dark masses only spent a few minutes on the rocks before taking to the air and heading up the North Channel, massing out towards the jagged dragon rocks, as I called them.
The fledglings that have made it past the kelp gull threat now have their sights set firmly on taking flight. Awkward gaggles of juveniles waddle clumsily towards the windward side of the island, seeking out the direction of the breeze that may lift them off the hard rock. With the lack of wind, this particular day is baking, and the dark-coloured gannet chicks really feel the heat.
Before long, we saw small gaggles of young birds that began to make their way down to the water's edge. This turned out to be quite a comedy, watching these Daffy Duck-like creatures battling to cross the stretch of boulders. Normally one bird would take the lead, and as it took a leap of faith into the water, we could sense the relief that it felt as it cooled down. As the pioneer headed into the surf, the gallery back on the rocks seemed in disarray. I wondered how on earth these birds would ever have the coordination to actually fly.
Meters away, a single seal patrols the edge of the rocks, gawking to locate the whereabouts of the fledglings. The waterborne gannet chicks are sucked out towards the open ocean, and the scene is set as the little bird bobs into rough water. The seal begins to eat the chick immediately, and the kelp gulls converge to pick up the scraps. The seal tosses the carcass about, trying to tear away the skin. And with more and more gulls overhead, all the remaining gannets look on.
As things got more and more violent out on the water, I couldn't help but feel sorry for the little gannets. They stared out at the disaster with such surprise on their faces. There's just no way we could work out what they made of this.
One of the members of the Malgas community that has remained independent of the staple food deficit is the oyster catcher. These secretive residents have a survival system robust and refined enough to be largely unaffected by the problems experienced by the fish eaters. Their domain is the littoral zone, the wet area splashed by waves that host damp weeds, mussels and other growth that they prize off the rocks with their adapted bills.
It's an area that no other birds have really utilized, so the oyster catchers are pretty much on their own in this environment. They're real little adrenaline junkies, working the edge of the rocks as the waves crash over.
As the summer progresses, the young gannets become more and more intent on leaving the island. Despite the threat of the seals, which are now a permanent presence off the island, the gannets take to the water in an attempt to create more runway space.
Some of the birds leapt into the sea, heading out into the North Channel where they could face the wind unobstructed. The flight school involved flapping into the wind, looping up, and then nosediving when the fear of heights kicked in. Meanwhile, back on the ledge, the land-bound flappers were proceeding with gusto, kicking up fluffy feathers that they'd recently shed. While the braver gannets in the water continued with the swoop and dive technique.
The first signs of malevolence appear when the loitering kelp gulls take off, and within minutes the clouds of birds over the breakers signify the presence of another Cape fur seal. The gulls seem to be the harbingers of doom for the gannets, and here they crowd over a fledgling fighting for its life. As the seal settles into consuming its prey, another drama plays out in the Malgas story. As the day wears on, the embattled gannets wash ashore, and even those that escape the seal are sometimes battered by the waves around the rocks. As these birds clamber back on land, it becomes sadly apparent that most of them won't make it.
Over the days that followed, we ended up spending hours on the rocks at Slaughter Bay. On this particular day, the seals killed in a different fashion. By now, they had broken their hunting down into something that resembled a production line. Birds were hunted and disabled and left to float, while others were chased down. Fledglings floated on the surface randomly, and the seals only returned later to eat each one consecutively. Seeing this was quite chilling, and the notion that the seals were going wholesale was the eerie factor. The gulls flew laps around the rocky inlet, and there weren't many gannets that made it back intact.
With the young gannets testing the feasibility of their existence here on the island, the adults are also battling with the lack of airflow. Ranks of fully grown gannets line the rocky ramps on the western side of Malgas, And every time the weak wind puffs slightly, groups of birds charge down the short slope and out to sea. Without the wind, even the most experienced flyers come short every now and again, landing in the foamy water along the shoreline. Periodically, one gets caught out by the hungry seal.
This was the first time we'd seen adult birds taken by the seals, and until now the problem wasn't as profound to us. These seals are hungry, and substituting their lack of sardine diet with high volumes of seabirds.
A carcass washes up at the foot of the takeoff rock. At close quarters, we can see that the seal actually eats out the soft body cavity of the gannet, leaving behind a lifeless hollow form like a gruesome puppet. Malgas is a dramatic place, a stark, breathtaking environment bearing sad tidings. Whilst the island endures, the food in the surrounding ocean is disappearing. The high volumes of sardines have gone, and whilst it's accepted that this fishery is no longer viable, both from a human and a gannet perspective, it's the hake stock that is now under pressure. What is happening here is a tragedy. In amongst the magic and beauty of this dramatic breeding location, the knowledge that these creatures are reeling from a lack of nutrition and that this problem is getting worse is disturbing. On the ground, the barren areas between busy nesting zones are bigger than the last time we were here. Yet the birds just seem to press on, regardless. Perhaps they don't have the capacity to question their predicament. They just deal with it the only way they know how. Multiplying and surviving on the flat, slippery surface of Malgas Island.